Hello and good evening to this evening's event at the Natural History Museum. My name is Tim Littlewood. I'm Executive Director of the Natural History Museum. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening a conversation between two important members of the Natural History Museum. This is Professor Ken Norris and Professor Yadvinder Malhi. I'll explain a little bit more about them in a moment. The topic for this evening is biodiversity in the age of the Anthropocene. Professor Ken Norris is our Head of Life Sciences here at the museum. Ken joined in April 2020, and prior to that he was Director of Science at the Zoological Society of London. And before that he has 15 years of experience as a researcher and an academic at the University of Reading. Ken is in charge of one of the biggest collections that the museum has. We have 80 million specimens, and the life science collections are bigger than all the other collections put together. Ken's research is on biodiversity change, and more specifically the causes and consequences of biodiversity change. He's particularly interested in agricultural systems and the impact those systems have on biodiversity, both here in the UK and especially in West Africa, where farming practices interact with biodiversity. His other interest is on conservation of endangered birds, particularly in tropical islands, not bad for fieldwork. Ken is leading the conversation this evening with Professor Yadvinder Malhi. Yadvinder has joined the museum recently as a trustee, but he has quite a few other jobs as well. He is Professor of Ecosystem Science at the University of Oxford. He's Jackson Senior Research Fellow in Biodiversity and Conservation at Oriel College. He's Director of the Oxford Centre for Tropical Forests. And last but not least, he's Director of the Oxford University Biodiversity Network. Yadvinder's research is on broadly the impacts of climate change. He's particularly interested in protecting and restoring biodiversity and the biosphere and understanding the interactions between the biosphere and conservation. In other words, how is the environment changing? How can it adapt to climate change? Yadvinder's research is equally impressive in terms of his fieldwork. He works in Amazonia, in Africa, and Asia. Now, between Yadvinder and Ken, they have together over 600 publications in peer-reviewed journals. This is a remarkable output, and between the two of them, that's quite staggering. They also have, and they also share, an extensive body of fieldwork behind them. So with two quite remarkable individuals in conversation together this evening, you have a unique experience ahead of you, and you have a unique opportunity to ask questions. And I would encourage you to ask questions in the chat as we go along. Whilst Ken is leading the conversation with Yadvinder, understanding biodiversity and the Anthropocene, you too have an opportunity to pose questions throughout the evening, to interrogate them a little further, and for you to better understand what biodiversity change looks like in the age of the Anthropocene. So do please ask questions. Without further ado, I'd like to turn over to Yadvinder and Ken.
Thank you very much, Tim, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the museum. It's a great privilege to be here this evening with a really good friend of mine and colleague, Yadvinder Malhi. And as Tim has introduced, it's our job to explain to you, I guess, what biodiversity in the era of the Anthropocene means, terms which I'm sure are quite strange and not obvious what those terms actually mean. And I guess our job, Yadvinder, this evening is to unpack those for people. So by the end, hopefully, you'll know a little bit more about that than you might do at the moment. We were going to start off with a little bit of a conversation about ourselves because Yadvinder and I are old friends. We've also, as Tim alluded to, worked together, particularly in tropical forests and farming systems in Africa. And I really wanted to start there about our shared history, Yadvinder, and ask you a question about what really kind of fascinates you about those systems we've spent best part of 10 years working on. Why are you attracted to them? Why are they important and significant?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Well, the work that you and I have shared in particular has been around smallholder agriculture in Africa, in cocoa farming in Ghana and coffee farming in Ethiopia. And as I was thinking about today's event, I was thinking about many conversations we've had in rather interesting bars in rural parts of Ethiopia or coffee shops in the early morning. And what we were doing in Ethiopia was trying to understand the challenges that coffee and coffee production as a livelihood for poor Ethiopian farmers, what challenges it faces in modern times. And there are two types of challenge. One is as populations increase, the pressure on the forest where the coffee comes from, the coffee is native to Ethiopia, how that pressure is changing the environment of the forest. And secondly, global climate change is making this region warmer and affecting where coffee can grow. So we wanted to understand to what extent the forest there provided ecosystem services to the coffee, how it protected the coffee from climate extremes, how it protected coffee yields, and how that could be, how the forest could probably be used to provide benefits to the farmers, and what the limits were of the benefits the biosphere can provide. I think broadly that links into the type of questions that interest us. You know, what does biodiversity provide in terms of providing resilience to the pressures of global change going on, whether in a small farm in Ethiopia or at the scale of the entire planet?
Well, from my point of view, other than a rather fondness of Bedeli beer, which you alluded to, is that I think if you take a walk, as many people have done, out into the countryside while we've been locked down in the UK, you'll see a farming system largely disconnected from nature. And I think those farming systems in Ethiopia and Ghana are really fascinating because the farmers really do rely on the environment in many ways for the production of their farms and therefore their livelihoods, the health and welfare of their families and communities. And that kind of moved me on from a longer history of always being fascinated in wildlife, but coming to the realization that you can't just think about wildlife as if it's disconnected from the rest of the world, as it were, like we're going to talk a little bit later about some of these specimens and why they're important. But wildlife is connected not just to the natural system of which it's part, but to the wider environment, the people that are living in it. And I think those systems for me are fascinating examples of how we unpack that. So in a biodiversity, in the Anthropocene sense, biodiversity very much in an age of humans very much closely connected to nature. Thinking a little bit more longer term about our evolution as scientists and how we've arrived here today now as colleagues in the museum, I guess. Kind of where did you scientifically start out, and how's your perspective of all this changed through your science career?
Yeah, I think my pathway was perhaps in some ways rather unusual to be here. I started off as a physicist, and in the late 80s I was reading books like by James Lovelock on the Gaia hypothesis, and thought it was really fascinating to try and understand the Earth as a system, and in particular what role life on Earth played in shaping the Earth as a whole. And so that led me to this very large-scale systems thinking approach. And for my postdoc, I went to the Amazon and lived on and off in Brazil for a few years. And initially going with a mission of trying to understand how was the Amazon responding to atmospheric change? What fraction of our carbon dioxide emissions were being absorbed by the Amazon rainforest? And we built a tower and we measured the breadth of the forest and the carbon dioxide coming in. But soon I realized that this problem couldn't be tackled as some sort of biosphere engineering problem or a physics type problem. Really to understand the function and fate of the Amazon forest, we had to understand the biology of that forest, the ecology. We had to understand the trees, how they functioned, how they interacted. And then more gradually, I appreciate that beyond that, we had to understand the soils, we had to understand the animals and how the animals shape the vegetation community. So now I would describe myself as an ecosystem ecologist, and what really interests me is the web of connections between organisms and how the functioning of life on Earth is built by this web that organisms weave between themselves in terms of all their interactions.
Interesting, isn't it? So my start in science was quite different, even though I tended to end up in the same place as you in many ways. I started off as a child with a fascination for wild birds. My grandfather gave me a bird book and I used to flick through the pages, not really knowing any of the species in there. And I was fascinated by them because they could do things that I couldn't. They could fly, They can sing. Yes, so this is very much not a Graham Norton show, so we won't be doing any singing before the end of this evening. So I was always fascinated by their behaviour, how they interacted. And through the years, as I got more interested in the conservation and ecology of those species, I realised that you can't think about those things disconnected from the system of which they're part. There are many people in the bird conservation world who will justify bird conservation on the grounds that if you conserve birds, then everything else is protected. There is some element of truth in that, but it's also stretching what we know about systems a little bit further, and it ignores some of the key components that we're going to talk about in a moment or two. So I increasingly got interested in the species and the parts of the system that was connected to birds and then more widely to each other. And then very quickly you become interested in, so what are the consequences of these systems for people? You know, kind of how does that interaction work? So that if we change little bits of the biodiversity of that system, how does that cascade through them eventually to affecting the lives and livelihoods of people? How do the decisions that people take feed back through those systems to affect the bird that you like to hear singing in a bush? So I eventually ended up in much the same place as you, but frankly never been particularly interested in physics or maths to get me there. So given that we are where we are now in a kind of, our science is very much embedded in the connections of life, shall we have a little bit of a talk to the viewers through some of the specimens that we've got here and talk a little bit about biodiversity and why it's important. And further, I'm going to talk to the camera because at home, on your computers now, I'm hoping that you'll be looking at an image of a cyanobacteria, a blue-green algae. This is a very precious and delicate specimen, which is why you're seeing it on the screen rather than first hand. It was collected, I think, in 1902 as part of Scott's expedition to the Antarctic. Cyanobacteria are found in freshwater and marine habitats. The toxins they produce can have some quite profound negative impacts on some of the life that lives in those systems. And our scientists have recently been back to the Antarctic and re-sampled some of the areas where those original collections came from. So we have, as a museum, an extraordinary opportunity to look at literally 100 years of change. And so I was really interested in your perspectives on small life like that, and as a person interested in the whole Earth, what sort of role do those organisms play? Why are they important?
Yeah, that's an amazing specimen, Ken, just amazing to see that. And cyanobacteria themselves are truly amazing. And one definition of biodiversity can be it's about the varieties of type of life on Earth and what that life does. And often we're bewitched by the more obvious charismatic life, the birds and the mammals. But microbial diversity is astonishing. There's so little we know about what that microbial life does. And just looking at cyanobacteria, they, as well as in the Antarctic, they're found on deserts, encrusting much of the Sahara Desert. They're found on mountaintops and rocks, and they're found in particular across the ocean. And much of the productivity of the ocean originates through cyanobacteria and the photosynthesis they do. And cyanobacteria first emerged around 2 billion years ago, when life on Earth was half as old as it is now. And when they emerged, they had a huge consequence. They pumped oxygen through the photosynthesis into the atmosphere. It's called the Great Oxygen Catastrophe, when organisms before that had previously couldn't tolerate oxygen. They retreated into corners of life on Earth. And even now, most of the oxygen we breathe originates in cyanobacteria. It's often thought that forests generate most of our oxygen, and that's a bit of an urban myth because they consume as much oxygen as they generate overall. But it's the cyanobacteria generating oxygen that are fundamental to creating the atmosphere that we live in now.
Fascinating. So can we move on to something a little bit larger and talk to the viewers about this wonderful collection of Orthoptera, so grasshoppers and crickets. A confession from me that animals that Yadvinder and I know very little about, but just an incredibly beautiful set of specimens, I think you'll agree, including the one in the top left, I think, which is the largest example of its kind. I wanted to use this as a kind of an opportunity to talk about insects, an incredibly important speciose group of animals that do many, many roles in ecosystems and the wider Earth system. I mean, there's lots of reports at the moment about insect declines. Are you concerned about those kinds of changes? And if so, what worries you about them?
Yeah, well, this is a gorgeous section there, Ken, it's amazing. And one possible definition of biodiversity is also the number of species on Earth. And if you just take that the number of species definition, most of biodiversity is found in animals, and within that, most of it's found in invertebrates, and in particular insects. And here you can just see the range of forms and functions you can see in even quite closely related insects. And this matters for lots of reasons. It's part of it is the sheer exuberance of the way life invents and reinvents itself in different forms. But these insects also play major roles as foodstuffs and food webs that feed much of life on Earth. Lots of other roles that we know about, like pollination, pest control, various controls like that. So when we hear about possible declines of insects due to farming and other methods, we need to worry about, again, this web of connections and how the loss of key nodes of these webs can affect the functioning of all of life on Earth.
So they also remind me of a rather funny story of my own circumstance, in that I'm one of these people who rather likes leaving areas of grass around my house to grow long for the flowers and insects. And if you go and mess around in those, you see a lot of grasshoppers and crickets. This drives my wife mad, who would rather like the garden to look a little bit more respectable. It also reminds me of the museum's Urban Nature project, where we're trying to do something similar about putting green spaces back into urban environments. And so you're right, these are stunning specimens, have got a really big global message to say, but I'm also mindful of being in the doghouse as a consequence of part of my attachment to them.
There's a lot to be said for ethically lazy gardening.
Yeah, it's true. Can we move up to move up in scales to Hope the whale, we're privileged to sit in close proximity to the largest animal ever on planet Earth. An example, it's called Hope the whale for good reason, because whales, as you well know, have declined extensively around the world's oceans because of whaling, but are now recovering. We spoke earlier today about a newspaper story very recently about blue whales being seen for the first time off the shores of South Georgia in the South Atlantic, as evidence that global actions can really make a difference. But these magnificent animals are important even beyond their own value. So in terms of the kind of work that you do and the Earth system perspective, why do whales matter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whales, in particular the blue whale, is a very striking story. It's quite hard to often realize just how many whales there were on Earth. So if you go back a few hundred years, of just the Antarctic blue whale subspecies alone, there were around 300,000 whales. And in the 1970s, that was down to a few hundred. They're almost extinct. And now we're at about 20,000, 30,000. So it's a real sign of the whale population beginning to recover, but a long way to go. And as well as being amazingly charismatic animals in themselves, there's some really interesting recent science, and myself and some colleagues have had a small role in some of this science, showing what role whales play in the functioning of the ocean ecosystem. And one of the big challenges in the open ocean is that the light's at the top of the ocean, where all the photosynthesis can occur, but all the nutrients are in the deep ocean, because when animals die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean, and they're stuck there. So the light and the food stuff is all in the wrong places. And one of the interesting discoveries emerging from science is that the role that whales play by diving deep and either feeding or just mixing up the waters in the deep ocean, and then coming back to the surface and defecating in the open surface waters and providing all this fertilizer that fertilizes the phytoplankton and provides this cycle of nutrients that both stimulates the ocean and ultimately through migratory fish or seabirds, some of those nutrients end up on land and then get moved around by animals on land. So animals like the whale are provide an essential link in this chain, pumping nutrients from the deep oceans back into the continental interiors.
I think that those recent stories emerging of the scales over which nature is connected are just really incredible. And that kind of moves us into, from talking about biodiversity and why it matters, to talking a little bit about the Anthropocene, this age of human impacts on planet Earth. And you've published and talked quite extensively about the Anthropocene. So what does all that mean to you?
Yeah, the Anthropocene is a word that may not be familiar to everyone listening. It was about 20 years ago, a scientist called Paul Crutzen, as the only sort of environmental scientist to win a Nobel Prize, and he came up with this idea to describe the idea that in recent decades or centuries, human influence on the world has become so large, so overwhelming, that it's beginning to change many of the fundamental life processes on Earth. And it isn't just about climate change, though that's certainly one key element of it. It's about the way that our spread and influence is affecting biodiversity, affecting the Earth's life support systems. And it's proposed that the Anthropocene began, say, in the mid-20th century when things really ramped up in terms of human influence. But with all of these ideas, in any human act, there were long precedents and antecedents where humans have been altering the environment of different degrees of intensity throughout human history. But it's only recently that pressure has started to become so profound that it's changing the Earth system as a whole. And this is what the idea of the Anthropocene tries to capture.
So can we have a talk about a couple of the specimens that we have here as kind of participants in that bigger process that you've just talked about? And kind of, so right in front of us, sat on this a red wooden box, is a magnificent bird that sadly is no longer with us, called a great auk, which used to occur across the North Atlantic in rather massive numbers. People believe that their populations began to decline during the changes through the last ice ages, but were really precipitated by people using these birds to provide feathers for their pillows and for food and collecting eggs and for all sorts of other reasons. And so these birds eventually died out, I think it was in Iceland in the mid-1800s, and there are, I think, less than about 70 or 80 specimens now around in museums that are the last remaining examples of what were, as I said, a really abundant species. So in terms of this as an example, what sorts of kind of processes and threats and impacts did this species face that's very much in line with the bigger picture of the Anthropocene that you've just painted for us?
Yeah, so it's a really sad, sorry tale of the great auk, and we're so lucky that the blue whale, didn't go the same way. We came so close to it in some ways. And so with the great auk, when it had a big decline in the 17th and 18th century, this is the time when sailors were spreading out from Europe in particular, using the auk for meat and for eggs, and also, as you said, with the down industry. And so I think it epitomizes one of the challenges of the Anthropocene, that there's increasing global connectivity between nature and markets and demand, and you can be quite displaced from that. So if you're making pillows from great auks, you don't necessarily realize that this species is on the edge of extinction while you're doing it. And I think it epitomizes one of the challenges that we face now, that our ability collectively as humanity to exploit nature is more rapid and more powerful than ever. But also our ability to respond and change pathways is more powerful than ever through connections, through communications, through awareness of these issues. And so we face this constant race between the speed at which destruction and new threats can emerge and the speed at which new solutions and awareness of those threats can emerge and solutions be found.
So can we talk about the other specimen that we have here? And I have to pick it up
I'm
very
curious about this one,
carefully
Ken.
and put it on my lap. So this is my chance to be a Bond villain, and so apologise. This is a Tasmanian devil. It comes from our collection, and I thought it would be interesting to talk about this as an example of one of those species where concerted action based on science is now helping to conserve species like this in the wild, with still an uncertain future, but at least not an inevitable outcome like the example of the great auk that we just talked about. And Tasmanian devils are interesting because the thing that threatens them is a rather unique cancer that grows on their face, a facial tumour. It's very unusual as a cancer because it's transmitted by touch between animals. So if they fight each other, if they mate with each other, they can pass this cancer to one another. There are only a few of those kinds of cancers. Fortunately for all the people now getting nervous, only found in animals, not in humans. And so really desperate situation where these populations are declined to really small amounts. And so what people did was, in the wild, they tried to protect populations that hadn't seen the disease. But they also did genetic studies, of which this very animal was part, to look at the genomes, the sequence of the sequences within these animals' DNA as a way of working out how genetically diverse they were. This matters because often it affects your ability to fight diseases. And then created an entire captive breeding program with individuals designed from those genetic studies in order to preserve as much of that important variation as possible, so that when it was safer to release individuals back into the wild, they would be able to do so. And the good news now is that in the wild, individuals are surviving these diseases and recovering from them, so they're almost evolving a response to those impacts. So although the great auk is an example of a species that I guess we didn't get to in time, there are also examples like this Tasmanian devil, of where we can actually make a material difference, and as a museum we can contribute key information to that cause. I'm going to put this back down very carefully before kind of talking about moving on from that very species focused and asking you to kind of elaborate a little bit more about the idea that actually nature can be part of the solutions to these problems. So we're not just picking off species by species to conserve, we're actually thinking about whole systems and the role nature plays in that. Would you like to talk us through that? And I think we should have a graphic up on the screen for people to see to help you do that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ken. Yeah, and I think the juxtaposition of the great auk and the Tasmanian devil, one question that always comes to mind is what gives us hope for the future? How do we keep on thinking about conservation when we hear sad tales of the great auk and further threats that much of biodiversity faces? And often, I like to refer to this diagram that myself and a number of colleagues produced a few years ago when we were thinking about the future of tropical forests. And I'll talk you through this. Takes a little bit to unpack here. And on the left, we have what we could describe as the pre-Anthropocene ecology, a tropical forest in this case, or any ecosystem, where we've got a web of interactions. We've got lots of animals, lots of plants, lots of ecological interconnections. This is a healthy, intact, pre-Anthropocene ecosystem. And then we see this funnel, you could see it, this tightening of this web. And there are a number of factors doing it. The two that I illustrate in this diagram are these red belts. And one is land habitat loss, land use change, the decreasing habitat there. The other one is global climate change. And we could add others like harvesting and exploitation. There's other belts as well there. And it's easy to be tempted to get into a mood of doom and think this is just a funnel to decline and loss. But I would like to argue that we can at least see scenarios where these pressures are a particular product of our time, and may change in the near future. It's quite possible that we are able to get to grips with climate change and stabilize by the mid to late century. And many of our natural habitats, the particular confluence of pressures that are causing loss and destruction, may stabilize, both through active action and through natural demographic and economic processes. And so the ecosystems can emerge on the other side, but either, as in the bottom of that diagram, there can be highly degraded ecosystems if that bottleneck is too tight, or there can be vibrant and healthy ecosystems. They'll be different. We've already lost species. Climate change alone will mean that the ecosystems of the future are different from the ecosystems of the past, but they can still be vibrant and intact and rambunctious ecosystems. And those little blue hooks on that diagram are what we're trying to do now. We're trying to keep that bottleneck as wide as possible to allow vibrant ecosystems to come through on the other end of that diagram.
Yeah, so really fascinating. So in essence, that we do hear a story about planetary change that is worrying, concerning. I read a news report only last week about the majority of young people have grave concerns about the environment and the consequences that would have for their lives. But the important message from all of this is that there are choices still to be made and that the future is not cast in stone. And if we make sensible choices, we can emerge in places that conserve nature, preserve some of these natural systems, but also do so in a way that supports the planet to support us. And so there's a kind of virtuous circle there. So just to I want to kind of move on and talk a little bit about museums in a moment, but if we kind of just reflect on the challenge Tim set us at the beginning, which was talk about biodiversity in the era of the Anthropocene, what are the kind of really key messages on those two things just at this point that you might like the viewers to take away from the conversation we've just had?
I would say that biodiversity is intrinsic to the Anthropocene, so the future of everything we do on Earth and human societies is intrinsically linked to the future of biodiversity. It isn't just there as a pretty backdrop to the human drama. It is the life support system that supports itself and also humanity as well. And working with biodiversity can be part of the solution. It can be our ally in tackling these challenges of how do we create a sustainable future, a sustainable civilization. There's a lot of interest now in what are called nature-based solutions. To what extent can we work with restoring nature as a way of building more resilience in our climate and in our society and many other aspects of life on Earth.
That's fascinating. So we're sat in the Natural History Museum, one of the most kind of iconic buildings and places in the UK, one of the most important natural history collections in the world. So let's talk for a few moments about the role museums can play in helping us map out this more positive future. So this museum's got 80 million plus specimens in it that go back, depending on what sort of specimens they are, very long in time indeed, from a few centuries to millions of years, that we've got specimens that come from all over the world. So even if we just focus on the biological part of that, that gives us insight over changes in space and time of several centuries at global scales. As a trustee coming into the museum, what do you think some of the challenges and opportunities for a museum to engage in that bigger Anthropocene science and solutions-based work?
Well, the museum is this fantastic resource, this fantastic library of life on Earth, and there's many things that museums are doing fantastically already. There's lots of examples of how the collections and analysis and interpretation of the collections helps us understand how life has changed and how we can work with life to find solutions for the future. But I guess what really interests me as a trustee is to look at perhaps things that are a little bit more outside of the usual of what museums do, which is to think about these questions around global change and what can our knowledge of life on Earth contribute to addressing these questions, whether it's in terms of ecosystem restoration locally in the UK or in our urban landscapes, or in terms of global and planetary change. And I think the museums can have a role to play both in the science and what they do there and the type of research that's being done. I'm really interested in exploring those potentials in the museum. but also in the education. This is such an iconic a symbol for much of the world's public, let alone the British public, about life on Earth. And how can the messaging and the communication of both the urgency of the planetary challenge, but also the messages of hope and how we deal with it, how can they be conveyed through the reputation and the influence that the museum has?
So a couple of examples that I really like about some of the museum science that speak to that bigger picture comes from plants and something I know nothing about, minerals and rocks. And the first one is there's work going on at the museum which is looking at crop plants like wheat, but using the collections to look at how those plants have changed over time. The wheat that's grown every summer in this country is incredibly modified through selective breeding to be well adapted to the environment that it finds itself in, which is very heavily managed by farmers in terms of chemical inputs and other things, but very poorly designed for a world in which the climate is changing. Some of the pests and pathogens it faces might be different. And so there's work going on to learn lessons about what those plants were originally like in terms of their genes and their relationship with other animals and microbes, as a way of then working out how we might design crops that feed people, that are more sustainable environmentally, but also more resilient to a changing environment. The other area about minerals and rocks I think is fascinating, simply because we're all attached to our mobile phones. We have an iPad for answering questions. Later, other tablets are available on the market, in case you think I'm advertising. But they very critically depend on metals and minerals that are mined, a very environmentally damaging activity. But also those kind of minerals and metals are key for next generation energy generation, which will move us from fossil fuels and essentially therefore help us deal with some of the issues around climate change that you talk about. And I think really illustrates some of the challenges and difficulties in thinking about these these issues in a much more joined up way. So that if we need technology, we want technology, but we also need solutions to climate change in a way that we don't make those issues worse, then areas that we might as environmental scientists find challenging, like mining, become quite important as issues to think about in a much more integrated way around that. So those are kind of a couple of examples that really fascinate me about the museum's work. I'd just like to finally in the conversation zoom back out to that big global picture, and you talked about museums as kind of the repositories effectively, not just of these wonderful specimens, but the data that's in them. And we've got a kind of a graphic to share with you about bending the curve, which is essentially an attempt to think globally about how we turn from, as you can see, viewers on the screen, curves that look rather depressing, that decline, and trying to find some of those nature-based solutions you talked about. So what's the idea behind this kind of work, and how do kind of museums and the data that's in them help us this kind of global picture?
Yes. Yeah, I think this is a terrific example of how some work in which the museums played a major role that came out a month or two ago is looking at some of these larger challenges of the Anthropocene and how we deal with it. So something that's, again, not in the conventional territory of the museum, but the Natural History Museum has really played a pivotal role in this sort of analysis. So the bottom curve in this figure shows, the grey line shows the business as usual scenario of what biodiversity will do over the coming century, the ongoing decline because of habitat loss, climate change and other factors causing a further decline of biodiversity. And what this analysis did is look at a range of factors in what's called an integrated assessment model that brings in economics and biosphere ecology and various factors to try and build an integrated understanding of different scenarios. And what the orange line in the middle shows is if we have a lot of what could be called conservation actions, try to increase protected areas, increase the level of protection, particularly in the developing world, in tropical countries, what that could do in terms of the path of biodiversity, and that can stop the ongoing decline certainly, but it doesn't really bend the curve upwards and have biodiversity recovery. And then the top line in this figure, the green line, shows if we also do things on the demand side in terms of thinking about, particularly about ourselves as citizens of rich, wealthy countries, what we do in terms of the diets, the amount we consume, the nature of the materials and the supply chains about what we consume. And it's only when we think about that consumption side or the demand side that we really bend the curve and bring biodiversity back upwards as well. So what it does, I think there's a big element of equity here as well. It isn't just about deciding what happens in tropical nations and other nations and helping influence those. It's also as much about shaping what we do as consumers of the Earth's resources and how we can better consume in more ethical ways, in more sustainable ways. And so I think that this particular study is a really hopeful one, I think, that shows us that there is a possible future where we open up that bottleneck and have a resurgent biodiversity on Earth. But it requires action both at home and across the world to make that future possible.
Yeah. So it's interesting just to kind of sort of wrap the conversation up and move on to questions. I think if we learn anything from COVID-19, it's what you've just said at the end, that although we can think of ourselves as isolated parts of the world, we aren't. The decisions we make are all interconnected with each other, and we can work together to find those positive solutions you talk about, or we can drift apart and suffer to some extent the consequences, which is largely what the world is experiencing at the moment. And I very much hope that this will be a poignant reminder and some hard lessons to learn, but lessons that are valuable nevertheless. And so I hope that we're going to take some questions now, but I hope that, thanks Yadvinder for that conversation. I think hopefully for the viewers looking at this, you'll have a little better idea of biodiversity, what it is, why it's important. You've seen some fascinating, beautiful creatures, but you've also heard, I think, some really important stories about why these things matter beyond just what they are. And also, I would hope a really positive message that although the state of the planet isn't in such a good state as we found it, I guess you'd say, but nevertheless, we're not past the point at which we can make some positive choices for the better. So I just kind of like to end the chat at that point and move to some questions. So forgive me, I'm going to read these off the tablet. And okay, I'm a little bit. Okay, so there's. We mentioned the UK agriculture at the beginning of the programme. Leaving the European Union may give the UK an opportunity to reshape agricultural policy to protect biodiversity. The question is, what should we do?
I think that's a good question, and I think we are at a very tantalising time in thinking around British landscapes. There's suddenly a lot more agency about possible scenarios for the future. There's a lot more uncertainty as well, as we think about it, and as traditional landowners think about where income and subsidies will come from outside the European Union. And I think also there are other big policy levers. The government has announced quite ambitious targets for mitigating climate change and being net zero by the middle of this century. And as part of that, there needs to be an absorption of carbon by the landscape. These are what are called negative carbon emissions. So I think what we need to think about are what are ways that we can think of alternative ways of managing the land, providing incentives that preserve rural livelihoods, still preserve traditional stewardship of the land, but provide viable income, and it could be through carbon resources, or it could be through other ways of subsidizing that enable a restoration of biodiversity, and also to do it correctly, so not to do it in terms of monoculture plantations or monoculture bioenergy crops, but to do it in terms that respect the benefits of natural biodiversity and also the resilience that biodiversity provides in terms of climate change.
Yeah, I'm a bit mindful of the comment, the conversation we had right at the end of our chat about being part of a global system. and nowhere is it truer than in the food system. So we still import to this country, and will do after we leave the European Union, a very substantial fraction of our food supply. It varies depending on which bit of it you're talking about, but we're talking about imports in the region of 50% of what we consume. So in answer to the question, it's not just about what we do in Britain, although that will affect profoundly the environment that we immediately experience. It's also about the choices that we make about the food we eat and where that comes from and the conditions that it comes from, both environmental and societal conditions that are important in that. So it's a great question about, and I think this was, Holly, thank you for asking it, it's a really important part that will shape farming in Britain, but we are not divorced from the rest of the world in terms of our food supplies. And the next question, thanks for Dean for asking this, is of the many positive future impacts that humans could have on biodiversity, which are both the most urgent and the most achievable in the short term?
I think the most urgent, almost certainly, I think, is trying to slow down the ongoing loss of natural habitat. I have a particular interest in tropical rainforests that have great stores of biodiversity. So what are the ways that we can come up with pathways that slow down tropical deforestation? So let's keep what's there and not lose it. I think that's priority number one. And then in parallel to that, what can we do to bring back biodiversity where it's been lost, either recently or in the long term? So I think we need to look at landscapes in Europe and in the UK, which and when I've worked in the Amazon and with colleagues in the Amazon who've been very committed to slowing down deforestation in the Amazon, but they do turn around and say, we live in amongst them here in the UK and amongst the most deforested landscapes on Earth, and what can we do here to start thinking about biodiversity at home and how to bring it back?
And I think that it's important in this that slowing down loss is an immediate thing that we can do. I think kind of restoring systems does take time.
Yes.
And that's an inevitable part of this process. And part of the challenge is that the timescales over which the Earth system changes are often quite long compared with political cycles. And so it's important as members of society, I guess, in this, that if these are changes that we want to see, that we're passionate and we believe in them, that we're going to have an advocacy job that won't be done tomorrow. It will take time. We need to be out there tomorrow, the week after, 5 years, 10 years down the line, talking about this stuff, and so that it gets into societal consciousness, and that people, if they're now detached to some extent from nature and the issues you and I have discussed, in a few years' time, thanks for organisations like ours and many others, hopefully won't be, and can carry on that conversation. And that pressure on the people who make decisions to make more favourable ones, which this is not a choice about growth and prosperity on the one hand and nature on the other, because those two things are intertwined. A degraded planet is bad for economic growth and prosperity, and for health and well-being of people, and for the environment. So that's the message we need to get across, however challenging it will be, I think. So thank you very much, Dean, for that question. And Ian, you've asked us about the engagement challenge, and you rightly point out that this is both immense and urgent. But you'd like us to think about what lessons we might have from the last 30 years of attempts at climate engagement to inform the biodiversity one. So I guess this is a question that's aimed at how well have we convinced people there's a climate emergency, kind of where's that worked and why it hasn't. What lessons might there be for the wider piece that we're talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an easy answer to that. And even with the climate emergency, the challenge, the battle is half won. I think there has been a lot of movement, but there's still very recalcitrant parts of the world on that challenge. I think what has been powerful there is firstly the role of science, and I think one key issue around climate change was that an international body like the IPCC was created to take all these stories and come up with a a coherent message that this is what the world's body of experts thinks about this. So in all the wealth of information and scientific discoveries that come through, it was really valuable that there was a coherent synthesis of what was going on. And the biodiversity challenge has lagged behind in that. But I think recently with the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a parallel body to IPCC, I think we're approaching something similar, that this world expert body trying to synthesize what we know about the biodiversity challenge. And I think one thing is that biodiversity can also hitch on to climate change. Climate change has got political awareness and traction. And a key message that we can get across is that dealing with biodiversity can be one of the major tools in tackling both the mitigation, the slowing down of climate change, but also adaptation to climate change, how our food systems, our rural systems, our urban systems can be more resilient in a world with a changed climate.
I'm interested because you started your answer by saying that there's no easy answer to give, and the questioner who was sorry, I don't have your name on the tablet, is really asking two natural scientists this. And I was very struck 2 or 3 years ago. I read a really thoughtful opinion piece about climate change denial and why that was, and the critique in there was that you shouldn't be confronting climate change denialists with facts, because facts aren't what the problem is here. It's that you don't understand what their concern about the story that they're being told is. You also don't understand who tells them these stories, who influences those people to think the way they do and why. And that actually we all needed a really good dose of proper social science to unpack the way these messages are told and got across. So some people will literally have some strong influences who sadly aren't you and I. And in order to get these messages across, we need a much better understanding of how the social dynamics of these views work. So when climate denial arises and spreads, how does it spread? What are the mechanisms through that? Why are people receptive to those issues? And how can we insert ourselves into those debates in order to get the views that we feel are important, and I guess evidence-based, based on science, across to those? And I still think that's a challenge we've yet to meet, but nevertheless an important one.
Yeah, I just add to that, I think a key part is also not just accepting the challenge, but then also understanding what to do about it.
Yeah.
And this is where the expert knowledge and the wealth of knowledge comes in.
Yeah.
We can declare a climate target, we can declare a biodiversity target, but how do we move through this complex web of society and people and planet and work out how best to achieve those goals?
Yeah. So I've got a kind of a related question in a sense. That's what has been your biggest challenge in getting others to understand biodiversity in the age of the Anthropocene? So apart from the terms themselves, I guess, but yeah. So what's that? What do you feel that there's a challenge there to get those concepts across? And if so, what's your experience of that?
I think I don't see it as a particular challenge. I think people are actually quite often intuitively receptive to biodiversity and how important biodiversity is. So when we're trying to link it to the Anthropocene, I think perhaps what I try and do is illustrate those connections and what we understand about them. So the people are fascinated by blue whales, they're charismatic, they're receptive to the need to preserve and understand the blue whale. But it's even more fascinating when you can draw the connection between the blue whale and the ocean nutrient cycle and the global carbon cycle. And then that draws it to the scale of the Anthropocene, that this isn't just about the loss or recovery of an individual species, it's about the healing of the earth as a whole.
Yeah, for me, it's very much about trying to contextualize biodiversity, the Anthropocene, that using those terms. I find that talking to people that aren't scientifically involved in working around them, those are not very helpful terms. But I think as soon as you start to ask people, well, you breathe air, you drink water, you eat, there's food in your fridge. Well, let's talk about where that comes from. let's talk about the role nature is playing in all of those processes, the things that are key to sustaining you as an individual, the people you love and the people you live around every day of their lives. And I think that's a way of opening people's minds, not to kind of, if they're not particularly vexed by the disappearance of great auks, they certainly should be concerned about those sorts of issues. And I think that's one way of trying to turn this into a much more human story than perhaps some of these kind of more abstract kind of examples of nature, in some ways, lovely though they are to us, and concerning as they are to us, might be less obvious to other people. Just a couple of questions before I get shouted at for going over time. And there's a couple of quick ones. Is biodiversity loss a problem for the UK? 2 sentences.
Ongoing, the UK has lost a lot of biodiversity in the last decade, so the loss is ongoing, and there are many challenges still, particularly as you mentioned around insect decline, but bird decline. So yes, biodiversity loss is an ongoing problem.
Okay, yeah, so the answer to that question is yes, it does matter, but unfortunately we're running out of time and haven't got long enough to kind of go through the detail. One final closing question, which I think really cuts to the chase in terms of the message we wanted to get out there. Yes, there are challenges, but there are opportunities. The future is about choices we can make and make the world a better place. So the final question is, what gives you hope for the future?
What gives me hope is thinking about that diagram, the bottleneck that I showed there, and this gives me hope. Hope gives me hope. That we have examples there of how things were on the brink of absolute loss and tragedy, and that things were turned around by the actions of activists, of governments, of people at different levels of society, just connecting together and changing the pathway of something. And if we can save the blue whale, we can also save the much more varied and multifaceted aspects of biodiversity of life and life on Earth.
So let's end the conversation there. I just thank you, Yadvinder. It's been a wonderful pleasure to sit here in this magnificent place and chat about this to you tonight. Everybody, I hope that we've done a decent job, as that Tim challenged us to help you understand biodiversity in an era of the Anthropocene. I hope you have done that. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Thank you for tuning in, and also very many thanks to all of you for your continued ongoing support for the museum and the work we do. And clearly there's work still to be done, but we're kind of committed and keen, and as Yadvinder summarised very nicely at the end, there's still hope, and so let's end on that note. So thank you very much for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.